Yeah, well, across the West Bank, we've seen, and I was at last there in the early 2024, and then I am just back, as you said. I have seen obstructions and obstacles being put up at every aspect of daily life for Palestinians. There is a systematic dehumanization of Palestinians across the West Bank and Gaza. When I was there, settler violence was at an extreme high, and over 1,000 blockades had been put off across the West Bank in the time since I had last been there. Just basic daily movements, ability to move, to travel, to live, to be able to go to your jobs, to do regular commerce. It is there's the opposite of an enabling environment, and we're seeing that over and over. Everyone I spoke with.
So you heard it, and now your blood is singing with the righteousness of undeniable moral clarity, because what you just witnessed was not some abstract policy debate or tepid diplomatic language. This was an indictment delivered by someone who has walked through the wreckage of colonial occupation and returned to tell us what we already knew, but what power refuses to acknowledge, that Palestinians living in the West Bank face daily harassment, humiliations, and the denial of their basic rights, and what's happening is nothing less than systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. The Oxfam chief is not speaking in hypotheticals or couching observations in careful bureaucratic hedging. They are naming the beast that stalks Palestinian existence with precision and fury, describing over 1,000 blockades erected since their last visit, obstructions at every turn of daily life, the mundane transformed into torture, through the slow suffocation of an entire people's capacity to simply be, to move, to work, to live. And you need to understand that we are watching in real time as the architecture of apartheid operates with algorithmic efficiency in service of ethnic cleansing. And here comes the bombshell that should shatter every comfortable illusion we've been fed about Israeli democracy and measured military response, because OHA documented 1,680 settler attacks across more than 270 communities in the West Bank in 2025 alone. That's an average of 5 per day. 5 daily assaults on Palestinian farmers and families and children. Israeli military raids and settler violence across the occupied West Bank is driving new displacement, shutting schools and disrupting essential services for tens of thousands of Palestinians, while the so-called international community wrings its hands and lectures us about complexity in both sides and the need for nuance. What nuance exists when 227 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank so far this year by Israeli forces? What moral equivalence can be drawn when armed settlers descend on villages with impunity, and 94% of all investigation files opened by Israeli police into settler violence from 2005 to 2024 ended without an indictment, creating a system of deliberate lawlessness that serves the explicit purpose of terrorizing Palestinians off their ancestral land? Let me drop another bombshell on you, because the complicity runs so deep and so criminally through the halls of American power that it should make every progressive activist's hands shake with rage. The United States has provided at least $21.7 billion in military aid to Israel since the start of the war in Gaza on October 7, 2023. That's billions upon billions of American tax dollars funding the weapons that reduce hospitals to rubble and transform children into statistics, and the Trump administration, in a display of naked colonial solidarity, approved nearly $12 billion in major FMS sales to Israel, while reversing the Biden administration's partial arms embargo, accelerating the delivery of bombs and artillery shells and advanced weapon systems that will be deployed against a captive population denied the most basic human rights. You want to talk about American values and our commitment to human rights and the rules-based international order, then explain how we can, with one hand, sign treaties against genocide, and with the other hand provide the ordinance that makes genocide materially possible. And don't you dare tell me that's hyperbole, when the International Court of Justice itself ruled that it is plausible that Israel's acts could infringe rights of the Palestinian people protected by the Genocide Convention, and ordered provisional measures that Israel has systematically ignored with American diplomatic cover. And the horror in Gaza demands we linger here, because the scale of destruction has been methodically engineered to break not just infrastructure, but the very possibility of Palestinian futurity. Famine is taking place in the Gaza Governorate, which includes Gaza City, according to the IPC, an officially confirmed famine happening in real time on our screens, while Western politicians perform concern and allocate another billion for Israeli military assistance. Israel is inflicting mass death, forcible displacement, starvation and deprivation upon more than 2 million people, and reducing Gaza to rubble, and when Oxfam and every major humanitarian organization on earth screams that Israel's policies and practices continue to systematically and deliberately block and undermine any meaningful international humanitarian response in Gaza, we are not witnessing the fog of war, or the unfortunate but unavoidable civilian casualties of urban combat. We are witnessing what happens when a militarized settler colonial state decides that an entire population is expendable and inconvenient to its expansionist ambitions. The numbers themselves are an obscenity, but they're necessary because we live in a world that has been trained to view Palestinian death as ambient noise rather than atrocity. At least 65,419 Palestinians have been reportedly killed in Gaza, and 167,160 have been injured, as of late September 2025, and those figures are conservative estimates that don't account for the thousands still buried under rubble, or the children dying slowly of malnutrition and preventable disease in the ruins of what used to be neighborhoods and schools and hospitals. When humanitarian workers use the acronym WCNSF, meaning Wounded Child No Surviving Family, they are creating vocabulary for a specific category of Israeli violence that has become so routine it requires its own designation, and if that doesn't curdle your blood and make you question every single narrative we've been fed about Israeli security needs, then I don't know what moral universe you're inhabiting. Here's another bombshell that exposes the genocidal logic at work. This is the latest chapter in the genocide that Israel is committing in Gaza, and part of a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing engulfing the entire Gaza Strip, according to Oxfam itself. And these aren't radical leftist activists making inflammatory accusations. These are seasoned humanitarian professionals who have worked in conflict zones across the planet, describing what they are witnessing with the language of international law. Without these supports in place, it amounts to forcible transfer, which in current circumstances amount to war crimes and a crime against humanity, and Israel's repeated displacement orders forcing more than 85% of Gaza's 2.3 million people into ever smaller areas, while maintaining a siege that prevents food, water, medicine, and fuel from reaching the population constitutes the kind of systematic destruction that defines genocide in international legal frameworks. And we need to talk about the dehumanization at the heart of this project, because it's not an accidental byproduct or unfortunate rhetoric. It is the necessary ideological infrastructure that makes the violence possible and sustainable. We see the dehumanization of Palestinians all around us in the way Palestinian deaths are treated very differently by the Western political media class than Israeli deaths, where Palestinian deaths are a statistic, while Israeli deaths are personal. Palestinians die in numbers, while Israelis die with names. This linguistic and representational violence mirrors and enables the physical violence, creating the conditions under which Western audiences can watch mass slaughter unfold and feel more outrage about university protesters disrupting brunch than about children being deliberately starved as a weapon of war. Let me hit you with the West Bank reality again, because while Gaza captures headlines, the quieter ethnic cleansing happening in the West Bank reveals the long-term colonial strategy at work. With more than 1,000 settler attacks in the first 8 months, 2025 is on track to become the most violent year yet. And these attacks are not random violence by extremist individuals, but rather a coordinated campaign that operates with state backing and military protection. According to the Israeli human rights organization, crammed, between 2022 and 2024, the residents of more than 50 Palestinian communities were expelled due to settler violence, entire villages emptied through systematic intimidation and assault, while the so-called most moral army in the world stands by or actively participates, because on some occasions, the IDF soldiers who are supposed to protect them instead participate in these violent incidents or stand by and allow them to occur. And the political economy of this violence matters because we're watching the Israeli government formalize what used to be merely tolerated. The government established 5 new settlements and advanced an unprecedented bypass legalization mechanism, enabling 70 illegal outposts to receive government funding and infrastructure without completing the formal legalization process, while 24,258 dunams were declared as state land in 2024 alone, approximately half of all land declared as state land since the Oslo Accords. This is not security policy, this is colonial land theft accelerated to warp speed under the cover of the Gaza war, seizing the moment when global attention is focused on mass casualties to quietly complete the annexation of the West Bank through settlement expansion and the violent displacement of Palestinian communities. The international law framework here is crystal clear, even if Western governments pretend otherwise, and this is where the hypocrisy becomes so thick you could choke on it, Because when the ICJ issued its ruling ordering Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this convention, including killing members of the group and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, the response from Israel and its American patron was to ignore the order entirely and accelerate weapons shipments. The daily average number of trucks entering Gaza with food, aid, and medicine dropped by more than a third in the weeks following the ICJ ruling, because apparently being ordered by the highest court of international law to prevent genocide is understood as permission to intensify the starvation siege. And here's where we need to connect the ideological through line, because this systematic dehumanization that Oxfam describes is not accidental or incidental, because Israel is a fundamentally unjust state established on fundamentally unjust principles. It is necessary for its citizenry to be indoctrinated from birth into a fundamentally unjust worldview, in order for it to make sense for there to be a society where one group is treated one way and another group is treated another way, just because of their religion and ethnicity. Israelis must be raised to see Palestinians as less than human. This is the architecture of apartheid in its purest form, the creation of a legal and social system that distributes rights, resources, and even the right to life itself based on ethnic and religious classification. And it operates through violence both spectacular and banal, through blockades and bureaucracy, through bombs and through the slow administrative strangulation of permit regimes and movement restrictions. Let me give you another bombshell about American complicity, because this is where progressive activists need to focus our rage and organizing energy. The U.S. repeatedly vetoed multiple UN ceasefire resolutions and shielded Israel from international legal scrutiny, even as civilian casualties in Gaza mounted and humanitarian conditions worsened. And despite internal State Department reports documenting more than 500 potential violations of international law by Israel, no action was taken. Because American support for Israeli apartheid is not a bug in the system but a feature of American imperial strategy in the Middle East. When White House lawyers rejected internal findings that Israel was deliberately blocking humanitarian aid, they were making a political choice to enable war crimes rather than enforce American laws like the Leahy Law, that prohibit military assistance to forces committing human rights violations. And the public opinion shift here is seismic and should give us hope for building mass movements that can actually constrain American empire, because after nearly 2 years of war, the American people support the Palestinians against Israel for the first time, and more than 60% of U.S. Jews believe that Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza, while 4 out of 10 believe that Israel is committing genocide. This represents a fundamental rupture in the consensus that has protected Israeli impunity for decades, and it happened because activists disrupted university campuses and blocked weapons shipments and refused to let polite society ignore the live-streamed genocide happening on our phones, because the images of unaccompanied children evacuating from northern to southern Gaza by themselves, wounded children sheltering outdoors in car parks and gardens, in what UNICEF called a war on children finally penetrated the media blockade that typically sanitizes Israeli violence. The humanitarian conditions in Gaza right now as we speak are apocalyptic, and that word is not rhetorical flourish. People in Gaza City are facing deteriorating access to means of survival amid intensified bombardment. Cooked meal provision in northern Gaza has dropped by 70% with only 8 kitchens currently operational. 1 million people are accessing less than the emergency minimum of 6 liters of drinking water per day, and 54% of essential drugs and 66% of medical consumables were at zero stock levels. In emergency departments, 45% of items were unavailable, including surgical supplies critically affecting life-saving procedures. These are the material conditions of genocide, the deliberate creation of circumstances calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a population, and it's happening with American weapons and American diplomatic protection and American military aid. Now think about the language the Oxfam president used in that clip, systematic dehumanization, and understand that this is the vocabulary of genocide scholars and human rights lawyers and historians of atrocity, because what's being described is not merely violence or even war crimes in the conventional sense, but rather the methodical elimination of Palestinian existence across multiple registers simultaneously. When they describe over 1,000 blockades being erected, they're describing the physical infrastructure of apartheid being built in real time, the creation of a system where Palestinian movement is so restricted and surveilled and disrupted that normal life becomes impossible, where going to work or school or the hospital requires navigating checkpoints and roadblocks and the constant threat of settler violence or military raids. And the political context matters enormously here, because this escalation of settler violence and military aggression is not happening in a vacuum, but rather under the protection of the most far-right government in Israeli history, a government that included Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who approved 22 new settlements, calling it a historic decision that signaled a return to construction, Zionism, and vision, openly articulating the ideological project of completing the Zionist colonization of all of historic Palestine through the violent removal of Palestinians. Israeli authorities have undermined legal efforts to stop the violence. Meanwhile, the government has intensified policies that undermine Palestinians' economic development, freedom of movement and land use, and violence from below, and policy from above, advance a clear strategic goal: the coerced depopulation of Palestinians from rural areas to solidify Israeli sovereignty over the entire West Bank. Let me connect this to the longer arc of colonial violence, because understanding the current moment requires seeing it as the acceleration of a project that has been underway since 1948. And what we're witnessing is not a conflict between two equal parties, but rather the final stages of an ethnic cleansing campaign that has been periodically intensified through decades of occupation. The systematic nature of the violence is what gives it away. The continued attacks targeting Palestinian Bedouin, peasant and rural communities do not appear to be incidental, but rather an intentional strategy to erase their presence in key agricultural areas, undermine their food security and food sovereignty, and ultimately sever Palestinians from their land, and these attacks have caused an estimated $76 million in direct agricultural damages in the West Bank between October 7, 2023, and late 2024, while the West Bank GDP declined by more than 19%, and the unemployment rate rose to 35%. This is economic warfare combined with physical violence, combined with bureaucratic strangulation, combined with ideological dehumanization, and it operates as a total system designed to make Palestinian life unlivable. And when Trump lifts sanctions on violent settlers, when he lifted sanctions targeting numerous far-right settler organizations and individuals involved in violent actions against Palestinians, including arson, property damage, and assaults on civilians, he is sending a clear message that the United States government endorses this ethnic cleansing campaign, that there will be no consequences for settlers who burn olive groves and terrorize families and destroy homes, that American power stands firmly on the side of colonial violence against indigenous populations resisting dispossession. The Gaza death toll I mentioned earlier doesn't capture the totality of destruction, because beyond the immediate casualties we have over 90% of homes in Gaza damaged or destroyed, leaving nearly 1.9 million Palestinians without a permanent and safe place to live, and famine had taken hold in Gaza City with all three thresholds of famine, catastrophic hunger, acute malnutrition, and mass death having been officially surpassed. This is what genocide looks like in the 21st century, not gas chambers and death camps, but rather the systematic creation of conditions incompatible with group survival, the destruction of the physical infrastructure necessary for life combined with the prevention of aid, and the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war. And Oxfam's language about systematic dehumanization connects directly to the legal frameworks of genocide because South Africa asserts that acts and omissions by Israel are genocidal in character, as they are committed with the requisite specific intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as a part of the broader Palestinian national, racial, and ethnical group. And the evidence for that intent comes not just from the scale of killing, but from the rhetoric of Israeli officials, from the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, from the prevention of humanitarian and from the mass displacement and the creation of conditions calculated to bring about group destruction. When states continue to send arms support to Israel, they are complicit in the genocide that continues to unfold. According to Oxfam, that's not activist rhetoric, but the considered judgment of humanitarian professionals applying the legal definition of genocide to observed facts. The international community's failure here represents a complete collapse of the post-World War II human rights architecture. Because what was the entire point of creating the Genocide Convention and the International Court of Justice, if not to prevent exactly this scenario, if not to intervene when a militarized state uses industrial-scale violence against a captive population? The ICJ found it plausible that Israel's acts could amount to genocide and issued 6 provisional measures, ordering Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent genocidal acts, but the Israeli government has failed to comply with at least one measure in the legally binding order, and the response from Western powers has been to continue arming Israel while lecturing protesters about civility and condemning anyone who uses the word genocide as anti-Semitic. So when you hear the Oxfam chief describe systematic dehumanization, when they talk about obstructions at every aspect of daily life, when they mention settler violence at extreme highs and over 1,000 new blockades, Understand that you're hearing an eyewitness account of apartheid and ethnic cleansing in progress, of a colonial project that has decided this is the moment to complete what has been attempted in stages over 76 years. And our response as progressives and as people committed to justice cannot be to equivocate or to hide behind false complexity or to pretend that this requires more study and more nuance, because the facts are clear and the moral stakes are absolute, and the United States government is directly enabling this catastrophe with our tax dollars and our diplomatic cover and our weapons shipments. The path forward requires us to build mass movements powerful enough to constrain American empire, to impose costs on politicians who enable genocide, to disrupt the flow of weapons and money that makes Israeli apartheid possible, and that work is already happening through BDS campaigns, and campus organizing and direct action, and political pressure, but it needs to scale massively because the unimaginable violence and suffering Palestinians in Gaza have been enduring for over 700 days needs to end now, and the moral failure of states to act is palpable. We are living through a historical moment that will define how future generations judge our commitment to human rights and international law, and the Oxfam testimony you just heard is one more piece of evidence in a case that is overwhelming in its clarity and devastating in its implications. That we are witnessing genocide, and that our government is making it possible, and that reality demands not careful analysis, but urgent action to stop the killing and end the occupation and dismantle the apartheid system that produces this endless recursive violence against Palestinian existence.